Hi, thanks for joining us today with what promises to be a fabulous discussion with General Frank McKenzie about his new book, The Melting Point. We look forward to talking about all of the leadership lessons that he learned during his time as the commander of CENTCOM. First of all, I'm Emily Harding. I'm the director of the Intelligence, National Security, and Technology Program here at CSIS. And I have the privilege to talk about this book today in part because I really asked for it. I'm a longtime Middle East follower myself, and I lived through some of these same events, but from a very different perspective than the general did. So I'm really looking forward to hearing about his perspective on all of these things that happened. Sir, reading your biography would take up half of the time that we have for this conversation today, so I'm not going to do that. I will just suffice to say that you have commanded at every single level, served as the director of the Joint Staffs, led Marines in combat, and ended your military career in the true hot seat as commander of CENTCOM. So thank you so much for being here.
Delighted to be with you here today, Emily.
This is a leadership experience told in three great big stories, but then also a lot of little stories mixed in. And it was a really exciting raid. I want to get into the discussion about Soleimani and his death, and Baghdadi and his death, and then also the withdrawal from Afghanistan. But let's start out with the title of the book, The Melting Point. Now, from what I can tell reading the book, you never actually melted. So do tell us why that for the title of the book? What does it mean?
Sure. So the line is taken from a great book by, I think, a wonderful historian, Barbara Tuchman, in her book, The Guns of August, which talks about how the nations of Europe entered the First World War in the spring, summer, early fall of 1914. And in the book, she uses a phrase, and the phrase is this: that melting point of warfare, the temperament of the individual commander. And so I was a commander. I was a combatant commander of the United States at the very apex of the chain of command, working for the president and the secretary, which was a unique vantage point, if you will. So that's where I sort of took I saw things. I was a participant in decision making, and I was a participant in execution, and not an observer, not looking on from the stands, but down in the arena. So those left a powerful mark on me, and I find it easy to write. I find it's a release to write, and so the book is a combination of several different things, but basically I felt I had some things I wanted to share, and this gave me the opportunity to do that.
Yeah, you have some really self-reflective moments in the book where you're sort of embedding yourself in the bigger sweep of history. And one of the things that you describe in intense detail is an hour you spend by yourself in the cabinet room in the West Wing. And it's just kind of a fluke that it turns out that way, but you get this wonderful moment to reflect. And you say, this I think speaks to just how wonderful a writer you are, you say, the history of our republic, measured in decades, was palpable. It was easy to imagine President John F. Kennedy across the table dealing with the exigencies of the Cuban Missile Crisis, or President Lyndon Johnson grappling with Vietnam, the war he did not want and the war he could not get rid of. Can you tell us a little bit about how you ended up by yourself in the cabinet room?
Sure.
And what that meant to you?
So that day was the 3rd of June, 2020. And I was called up to Washington to brief President Trump on a plan to exit Afghanistan. I actually flew up the night before, early in the morning of that day. I came to the Pentagon, sat down with the chairman, General Mark Milley. We talked about the plan we were going to share with the president. And it was really in response to his guidance to come up with a plan to get out of Afghanistan and go to zero. So we first of all, you comply with the order. I, my staff, and General Scott Miller, our commander on the ground in Afghanistan, had put together a pretty good plan for that. And so we're going to share that with the president. And what we wanted to do was was actually convince the president that he didn't need to make a decision to go to zero right then. What he needed to do was decide by, say, election day in November of that year, roughly, more or less, we thought we could be at around 4,500 U.S. people, and then he could make a decision then. Do you want to continue on a glide slope to get out by May, as the Doha Agreement required? Mm-hmm. And of course, we were keeping our part of the Doha Agreement. The Taliban was not, but we were keeping our part of that agreement. So we're up there to talk about that. So we went over to the White House and had our tests for COVID. Went over, and then the president held a separate meeting in the Oval Office that was sort of a pop-up meeting that I think had more to do with the events associated with the 1 June walk to Lafayette Square. So I was completely innocent of any responsibility for anything associated with that. So I said, General, why don't you go sit in the cabinet room? Mm-hmm. So got to sit in the cabinet room, and I've been in there before, but I've always been in there with my fellow combatant commanders, typically to have a photo op with the president, President answers a few questions from the pool reporters, and then you go do other things. So in there alone, you've got a lot of time to think. And I think I would tell you that the Marine Corps doesn't produce introspective generals. And I think Plato said the life that's not examined is not worth living. So you don't find a lot of people examining their lives in the Marine Corps. If you're doing that, you're probably not doing something you ought to be doing. And so we're not particularly reflective people, but in there alone for an hour, you can think about a lot of things. And I looked at my slides, looked at my brief. I knew they were meeting next door in the Oval on a separate subject. And we went down to the Situation Room and spent about an hour with the President talking about a path out of Afghanistan.
Yeah, that moment in history was in the middle of a lot of things going on between the protests and COVID and then also withdrawal from Afghanistan. But since we've started there, let's talk about that some more. One thing that really strikes me about the book in general is that it's a combination of these moments of intense action and then a whole bunch of bureaucratic wrangling that goes on behind the scenes, and then just the math and the lift associated with trying to pull everything out of Afghanistan. You go into a lot of detail. And there's paragraphs and paragraphs, but I thought that it was astonishing to see. You said, to evacuate 100,000 people as rapidly as possible, we would require 25 C-17 sorties a day with floor loading. So you're putting people on the floor of the C-17, which would extract this number of people in 19 days. So you have, in the end, you bring out more than 40,000 people in every measurable way. We exceeded our planning factors for outflow of people. And that paragraph follows, I think, a page and a half of just the math of war. So in the middle of trying to deal with the bureaucracy in Washington and make the political decision and give your best military advice, you're also working with the military planners to figure out what is physically possible on the ground in Afghanistan. Can you talk about how, as a commander, you tried to balance that big picture with that tiny, tiny tactical picture?
Sure. So as the combatant commander, I worried about two things. I worried about my logistics, which is the ability to move stuff around and move people around to make sure your people are eating, to make sure they've got ammunition if they've got to fire their weapons, to do all of those things. If they're injured, that you can take care of them and bring them out. And that requires a significant fraction of your time every day just thinking about that. And the other thing, equally important, is you have to look at the intelligence picture. So I would, if you go straight to operations, you're going to have a train wreck. Mm-hmm. So you understand the limits of the possible from your logisticians, and you understand also the limits of the possible from what your intelligence people tell you. We talk about it as intelligence-led operations, and if you don't listen to your intelligence people, you'll eventually pay a very steep price with that.
Well, as an intelligence person, I really appreciate you saying that. So.
It's vital. It's vital, they and the logisticians. And the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which really began in April of 2021 at scale at President Biden's direction, was a military withdrawal from Afghanistan, pulling our combat forces out, all of our equipment. And we basically completed that move by the middle of July. And about the time I relieved Scott Miller, our four-star commander, our very good four-star commander, came home, I assumed direct responsibility for Afghanistan then, with a two-star admiral on the ground in Kabul. And our force level of that was about 700 people that were guarding the embassy and the airfield there in Kabul. Mm-hmm. And so that, if there's a problem here, the tension would be back in April when we pulled out all our military equipment, all our military forces. At the same time, we did not reduce our embassy and bring it out. We did not bring out our American citizens, and there were tens of thousands of those. And we did not bring out the at-risk Afghans that were there, and there were many tens of thousands of those. And by at-risk Afghans, I'm talking about Afghans who fought with us, Afghans who were translators, Afghans who helped us in the multi-decade fight that we had undertaken in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. So we did not choose, and that was a decision made at the very highest level not to do that. So you get to mid-July, we're no longer supporting the government of Afghanistan, predictable, knowable, and warned. The government of Afghanistan begins to collapse. Now it looks like we might actually have to pull out these people that we did not bring out when we had the resources and the stuff, if you will, in place to do it. Mm-hmm. So you got to go back in and bring them out under very short notice. And you look at the images of August 2021, a direct result of that decision not to bring them out early when we could have done so in a measured way. Now, I would just add one more thing. If you did that, you got to face the fact it is possible that Afghanistan could have collapsed earlier.
True.
We don't know. That's counterfactual. Don't know. But we do know what happens when we executed the way we did, which is, of course, unmitigated disaster in the middle of August in Afghanistan.
Yeah. So I want to get back to that debate about the NEO, the non-combatant evacuation operation, and when you actually pull that trigger, because that's a very difficult decision to make, and you can see the tension between the military planners and the State Department in the book. But you say in the book that you had identified 12,044 potential American citizens and family members eligible for evacuation, also 13,304 non-American citizens who would be evacuated, add on a bunch of family members, looking at somewhere around 56,000. You've got a total of 67,920 you're looking at. You also add 20,000 Afghans for the SIV program. You add some here, you add some there. You were then left with a potential requirement for 141,920 people to bring out. That is an astonishing number. When you sat down with the planners to figure out how to do that, did they first have a panic attack and then get to work, or was it just all business?
No, everybody likes a challenge.
Yeah.
But we always felt, in my experience,
like a challenge.
my experience doing NEOs before, non-combatant evacuation operations, is it's always bigger than you think it's going to be. So we tend to double the number and add 20% or do something like that, which is about roughly how you get to 140,000. And as you know, ultimately we brought out 124,000 plus some others, so we weren't terribly far off on those numbers. Had we continued, we could have brought out many more tens of thousands, but for good reasons, we didn't continue beyond the 31st of August.
Right.
So we sort of knew that number from the beginning. And that was in our mind as a planning factor at Central Command. And of course, it's not just CENTCOM. I'm talking to Transportation Command, who provided the C-17s. And also, we're moving stuff out by surface. Low-value stuff's going out through Pakistan via the road network. So a lot of stuff actually came out by surface. Our people, our high-value material typically came out by air, but it was a multimodal operation, driven by the logistics feasibility of it. I would argue only one military in the world could do that, and that was ours.
100%. And it was, our allies were leaning so heavily on us to help them get everything out of country as well, that was a really important relationship to have. So on that NEO and the discussion of whether we're actually going to do a NEO, in the planning exercises that you describe, you say, the readouts of these exercises that were shared with me painted a picture of an interagency team that did not take the possibility of total evacuation seriously. In opening comments for the August 6th exercise, a senior White House official said, I don't think we'll have to do this being a NEO, but if we do, we have all failed. Tell us about that moment and trying to impress upon people that this was real.
So I think it's either, depending on your perspective, it's American arrogance or American exceptionalism that believes you can walk off the field and still dictate the terms.
Yep.
And you can't do that. The laws of history operate and they grind very small. And even the United States is subject to the laws of history. You can't ignore it. So you don't want to accept the reality of it. Doesn't matter. The reality is going to actually adjust your worldviews as you go forward. Mm-hmm. So no ambassador wants to declare a NEO because it is a statement of failure. The State Department doesn't like to declare a NEO because it's a statement of failure. We can't stay there. So I think, again, a combination of hoping to find some good in the situation. We waited too long to do it. There was certainly ample warning. It was very clear to everyone, at least on the side of the table I sat on, what days were ahead of us, and yet we waited too long to do it. And again, I would argue that contributed directly to what happened in August.
Right. So here we are in August and attempting to do this Herculean effort to get people out, to get stuff out, but at that point it's really mostly people, and to do it as safely as humanly possible. And we have to talk about the Abbey Gate some. Sure. There's a scene that you paint in the book where I think you sum it up absolutely beautifully. You say, it was here at this small entrance that U.S. policy, politics, and national decisions and the inevitable outcomes of those decisions became human reality. And you're talking about the crush of people, of Afghans trying to get into the airport to hopefully get a path out. The people who have the travel documents can't even get to the front of the line to show them to get into the airfield. And there are people waiting in line for days and days and days, and it's hot, and it's loud, and it's disorganized, and it's messy. And then you talk about the Marines who were guarding those various choke points, and you say to do the job they were doing for hours at a time, exposed to potential attack at any time, required persistent courage, the very hardest kind of courage, and it humbled me. You talked about, I knew that I was in the presence of the greatness of the American spirit in that dirty, concrete-walled entry point. It's a very emotional paragraph, but I think paints the reality of the situation quite clearly. What were you experiencing during those moments at Kabul International Airport?
So the picture on the book cover is actually me walking at Kabul.
Yeah.
I don't look happy in the picture because I'm not. I'm very concerned about what I'm seeing. I'm concerned about all the throughput questions. More people trying to get in than we can process. Not a military problem. It's not our responsibility to process and make decisions on who's coming in and who's not. Yet because of shortages in people who could actually do that processing, you got young Marines and then eventually young soldiers and airmen and sailors as well that have to make decisions, life-altering decisions that I'm sure, even for those that weren't injured while they were there, are going to scar them emotionally for the rest of their lives. It's a very difficult situation to be in. And North Gate, which is where I was at that particular time, I mean, the smell will be with me forever. The sense of calmness that you saw there, the people working the problem, doing the best you can with what you got, and the imminence of an attack, which was over us all the time. And when I talk about persistent courage, it's easy to get angry and do something brave. It's harder to do something brave for 8 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours, go get a couple hours sleep, come back and do something brave for another 12 hours. And that's exactly what we were asking the young men and women at these gates to do for many days, many days.
Right, that's a calm and a steadiness, despite all of the chaos going on around you, that is very hard to teach. And the service there was amazing. So looking at the sweep of what happened in those final days in Afghanistan, what lessons are you taking away from it for future conflicts?
Well, sure. At the highest possible level, contemplate something like the war in Afghanistan. Know what you went in for. We lost our sense of why we went in. We went into Afghanistan in the fall of 2001 to prevent further attacks on the United States from developing there. By 10 years later, by 2011, the mission was still that, but it had broadened to establishing an Afghan government. So you got mission creep, a profound sense of mission creep. So I think you need to ruthlessly define your mission, understand what your mission is, and stick to it. Look, many people, well, probably most people in this room understand the Taliban have no desire to attack the United States. They're not interested in that. It's the people they host that have a desire to attack the United States, whether it's ISIS Khorasan group or the remnants of al-Qaeda, both of which still operate in Afghanistan to this day. So do what you came in there to do, and then get out when that mission's finished. Be ruthless enough at the beginning so that you can accomplish it. We were not. We drifted. We wanted to do many things there. My assertion is Afghanistan is not ungovernable. It is ungovernable in a Western model, but it's not a Western country, and we shouldn't think that we can reshape it, to a Western country. There are many other tactical and operational things that happened in the course of the long campaign that made it impossible for us to win. And of course, my ultimate responsibility was just at the very end of the campaign, where all these things sort of came home. But ultimately, at the very end, you had two presidential administrations as unalike as any two administrations in American history, both of whom shared a consistent policy objective to leave Afghanistan regardless of consequences. So probably from President Trump to President Biden, there was no policy continuity anywhere except in Afghanistan, where there was perfect policy continuity. And that's how you get to a situation that actually takes you to August and the events that unravel there.
Mm-hmm. So in a lot of this back and forth, I sort of referred to it earlier, there's the reality on the ground and then there's the conversations going on back in Washington. You had been the guy on the ground, you had been the guy in Washington. How were you playing that role of trying to tell hard truths to the people who are making the political decisions? So
a combatant commander is unique in the American system because you participate in policy advice. You work for the president, you work for the secretary, and should they choose to let you into some of those meetings, you have an opportunity to give advice to one or both of them. Mm-hmm. So you give advice, but you are also uniquely charged with execution. So there are many people in our system who give advice that have no responsibility for execution. Mm-hmm. There are many people in our system who are responsible for execution but don't give advice. The combatant commander does both. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff gives advice, and he is the nation's senior military officer and the senior military advisor to both the president and the secretary, but he's not responsible for execution. The combatant commander is responsible for execution. And that's a nuance that actually is pretty profound. So you bridge that gap, and that goes back to the title that I shared with you. It's a unique command responsibility. So you get to give advice, and I gave advice on a number of subjects, some of which was taken, some of which wasn't. That's okay. That's the way it's supposed to be. The decision-making should not rest on the military side. We're a junior partner in those discussions. I was actually happy and satisfied that my advice was heard. I knew it would or wouldn't be taken, but once the decision's made by constitutionally appointed authority, you got to execute, and it's important that you execute. The Uniform Code of Military Justice requires you to execute unless it's an illegal order. I received no illegal orders, and I had 14 lawyers at CENTCOM who were happy to tell me if I received one. But I actually knew an illegal order when I saw it, didn't get one. So might not agree with the order, that's irrelevant. You execute the order. Because for the Republic, it's more important that military leaders take those orders and execute them than whatever the character of the individual decision made by the policymaker is.
Yeah, that is a critically important point, and you do talk about civilian control of the military quite a bit in the book, but draw that out a little bit for the future generations, some of whom are sitting in this room and will be in this position in the future. That idea that this order I may disagree with, but I'm going to execute on it because the broader system demands it.
So as a combatant commander, you're at the very top, so it's very clear. You're maybe in the room when the decision's made. If not, you probably got to talk about it, and a much smaller group may have made the decision, but you know about it first. And so you get a chance to digest it for a moment and then pass it on. But what's important is you got to own the order once you get it. You're responsible for execution. I never thought about resigning on a policy issue because I thought, first, it was cowardice. The people that were putting on the C-17s flying in to man the gates at Kabul, nobody asked them, hey, you want to quit? You want to quit? No, we made them, they get on the airplane. They got to get on the airplane. And so to quit because you disagree with it is actually, I think, an act of moral cowardice on a leader who's not in danger, him or herself. So I owe it to the people that are there on the ground to do it. But I also owe it to the concept of the way the Republic is designed, it is the civilians are in charge. We never want to be in a situation where generals resign because they disagree with policy decisions. That is bad for the Republic. Throughout our history, there's actually not a particular tradition of generals doing that. I would point to, here's one example that I always found significant to me. General George Marshall, Chief of Staff of the Army in the Second World War, in the spring of 1942, were pushing forces into Europe. He wanted to build up in England a plan called Operation Bolero for a cross-channel attack into the heart of France and Germany. President Roosevelt, for a variety of reasons, including being convinced by Churchill, wanted U.S. soldiers in the fight in 1942 in Europe, and he was willing to do that in the Mediterranean, in North Africa. So Marshall disagreed very strongly with the president over that, felt it was the wrong decision. The president eventually said, I want you to do it, and directed it. Marshall saluted and executed. A lot of Americans died in that campaign. However, in the long run, Roosevelt was probably right because it blooded the U.S. Army before they had to fight the Germans in the heart of France and Germany proper. So that's just one example. And believe me, you go back and look at the historical record, there was strong disagreement with that decision to go into North Africa. Much too much for us to go into detail here with. But there were others during the war where Roosevelt overrode his advisors. And that's the way it's supposed to be.
Right. One of our scholars here, Elliot Cohen, has done a lot of writing about this.
He's very strong on the subject. I refer to his writings frequently when I think about these things.
Yeah, and it's a really important back and forth because, on the one hand, you have policy people who maybe have never served in uniform at all.
Right.
And then you have, folks in uniform who know everything there is to know about the military picture, but then may not really understand the policy pressures. Right. And trying to have an open enough conversation between the two sides and sort of a basis where you want to understand where the other perspective is coming from, rather than just, that guy doesn't know what he's talking about.
But here's the thing, it's not an equal relationship. Military operations must serve policy. It's not equal. You get to make the case, but ultimately policy must prevail. And that's sometimes difficult for people like me to digest, but it's the only way it'll work. If it works any other way, it's not good for the United States.
You have a great line in the book about, over the course of my career, I've written 4 or 5 letters of resignation. Writing them always made me feel better. I would admire them, polish them, review my carefully crafted arguments and criticisms, and then put them away.
Right. Yep. I've got a stack of them.
Makes you feel better, though. So on this last question about the civilian control of the military, you talk about, in relation to the Baghdadi raid, this was the shortest version of the chain of command, from the president directly to the combatant commander. So do you think that that's healthy? Is that the way that we should be set up as a foreign policy establishment? And then what are the upsides and the downsides to that direct line of communication?
So in this case, we were talking about a discrete military operation against a very evil person. And so we knew where he was. The policy considerations had all been discussed before. Now we're just talking about, are we going to do the operation or not? So this is October 2019. We're in the yellow oval of the White House, beautiful room, looks out down toward the Washington Monument. Secretary Esper's on the call. He's traveling, but he's on the call. You know, you've got the Vice President, you've got the National Security Advisor, you've got all the President's key leaders in the room as well. The chairman's there. And the question is, it's really a pretty binary decision. We're going to do the raid or we're not going to do the raid. And we wanted to, there were other ways to get after him, but he had 14 children out there with him, which we knew served two purposes: sexual slavery, but also made it much more difficult for us to strike him with air-delivered fires, which would have been the least risk option, lowest risk option for us.
Of course.
But we just couldn't find a way to do it. I sent the guys that do this kind of work back and forth, and we could never find a way to do it where we weren't going to kill a lot of children. So eventually we elected to go with a course of action that placed a couple hundred Americans at grave risk, 200 miles behind enemy lines, so to speak. And we went in there, we gave him the opportunity to surrender. He didn't. We killed his team. 12 children, I believe, were successfully evacuated. We got them out without injury. He blew himself up with 2 children in a hole in the ground. Could have been better, could have been a lot worse, but that's the nature of these kinds of operations. But when I talked to the President, these were the things that I laid out. And it was probably appropriate for him to make the decision because I actually had the authorities to do the operation. But because we were going deep into Syria, it would involve negotiations with the Russians, with the Syrians. We'd have to let the Turks know. Really, it was something that the President of the United States needed to think about and do. And so with that, really, it's me at a table with the President. Other advisors are there. They've all had an opportunity to talk. But then finally, but I'm the person that's going to have to. I am the person that will have to walk out of the room and execute the task.
Right. Yeah. So let's talk about the Baghdadi raid. First of all, set the scene for us. What moment are we in history? What is going on, and how has this come to pass that you are in a position to actually take this action?
Sure. So in March of 2019, my predecessor, General Joe Votel, finished the ISIS campaign in the Euphrates River Valley. They knocked out the last ground-holding part of the caliphate. And they fought to the death, except Baghdadi fled. He was never big on fighting to the death. He liked other people to do it, not so much himself. So he fled out to western Syria with the children that we talked about, with a couple of wives and with a security element. And he went to ground in a mud-walled compound way out in western Syria, a couple of miles from the Turkish border. We were going after him. We were going to capture or kill him. It took us a while to run him down. We worked with partners, our agency partners, to finally locate him through a variety of means, determine that he was there. But again, he was very clever. He never went outside very much. He always had children around him, and he knew that it would be a very difficult solution set for us to target him without killing the children. So over time, what you do is you find, fix, finish is the formula. Mm-hmm. We found him, we fixed him, we knew where he was, and we just needed to determine we're going to finish him, and we were going to either capture or kill him, as I've already discussed. So you come up, you work a plan, you talk about it with the secretary. The secretary's okay, with it. Then you take it to the President at some point. And it was a beautiful fall day up in D.C. I'll never forget the day, and just a lovely afternoon sitting in the Oval talking about this. Flew back to Tampa that night, and the next day we executed the operation. And I'm in my command center, and which is in Tampa, and looking through dark, grainy images is what's happening on the ground. And at that point, you got a couple hundred people that are at grave risk. Would the Russians act up? We thought the Russians. So we decided we were going to tell the Russians shortly before we crossed the Euphrates River with what we would call the package, the force. And so the chairman called General Gerasimov. And we were having some friction with General Gerasimov right then because the Russians were pushing against us in the lower Euphrates River at a place called Deir ez-Zar. They were trying to build a pontoon bridge across, and we had said, if you finish the bridge, we're going to drop the bridge. We're going to destroy the bridge. And so we were at something of an impasse there. So the Russians were not predisposed to help us. So Gerasimov tells General
I think that's an understatement. The Russians were not predisposed to help us. Indeed.
They were not.
I remember at the time we were referring to that moment as the Battle of the Five Armies in northern Syria because everybody had a finger in the pot and everybody was trying to accomplish very differing sets of objectives.
They certainly did. But we were the largest and most capable army.
True.
And everyone knew it, including the Russians. Mm-hmm. So Gerasimov said, I'm not going to let you do it. And so we talked about that, and if there was a critical decision, that was it. We did not think he could see the assault force. We were confident we could protect our helicopters coming in, and we had a huge gaggle of fighters stacked up just east of the Euphrates River. If they had launched jets out of their airbase Humaima in western Syria, we could have blanketed western Syria with U.S. fighter aircraft. But there was one Su-35 that took off, normal patrol, so we watched it closely. Pilot went down to Deir ez-Zor, tooled around, did his thing, never went north. But we knew if they were going to shoot at us, we had MQ-9s, drones that were needed for visibility on the objective, communications and fire support too. They fly at 10,000 feet above the ground. They're defenseless. They're very slow. Anybody can shoot them down, even the Syrians.
Yep.
And so we watched them. So that was the thing I was watching. You watch it crawl across the screen. We had agreed if we needed at least one to do the mission. They didn't shoot them down. And the Syrians are not particularly brave when it comes to their air defense. They prefer to shoot at you as you're leaving, when they know you're not going to turn around and put a radar-seeking missile right through the dish of the radar. And so that's typically the way the Syrians respond to these types of things. And I don't know, for whatever reason, we'll never know because it's in the Russian chain of command, they chose to not act here. And I think that was the right move.
Mm-hmm. Your blow-by-blow of that entire operation is astonishing. I mean, for anybody who's a student of military history, they're going to love the blow-by-blow. For somebody who's sat on the policy side and on the intel side, I found it interesting for a lot of reasons. But one thing that shocked me is that overall, you were on the ground, your guys were on the ground for 2 hours. That is a long time to be sitting there in the midst of that battle of five armies when you know you're surrounded by enemies. It must have been an exceedingly tense 2 hours for you.
It's very tense, but we knew where everyone was. We had measures to look at people were moving. We were active in the cyberspace, talking about what was going on, putting out things to cause confusion. We have things we can do to make it hard for people to communicate that you're aware of. So all of those things were in play. But yes, a long time on the ground, and here's why: you want to give people the opportunity to surrender.
Exactly.
So you call them out. We were not going in to kill him. It turned out he killed himself, but we were going in to capture or kill him. And so that requires a little bit of time. And so we're lucky because that operation is in the middle of nowhere. And so you can build that wall. So I would just say, as an observation, the Israelis just launched a major hostage rescue operation. And so that's what happens when you do the same type of operation in a built-up area.
Right.
It's much harder to do. So when you talk lightly about, well, we can do these targeted raids in a city. No, you can't. When you do these targeted raids in a city, you should think about what happened with the Israeli operation, and you should think about Black Hawk Down in October 1993 and what happened to elite special operators, U.S. elite special operators there in Mogadishu operating in a difficult urban environment. It's just a lot easier when you're in the middle of the desert to do these kinds of spectacular operations. Mm-hmm.
And it was a truly spectacular operation. Your closing line in that section about Baghdadi: he had fallen a long way from the declaration of the caliphate back in Mosul. He died the death of a coward, hiding in a small tunnel with 2 children. He did not even try to fight the assault force, try to seek a genuine martyr's death. Contrary to some reports, there was no whimpering or talking from the tunnel before he triggered his vest. He died as he lived, by taking 2 innocent lives with him. It was an ignominious end to a harsh and evil life. I think that sums it up rather well. And of course, we have to say a word about Conan the Working Dog, because he was perhaps the most famous individual who came out of this
Conan,
operation.
a very, very important dog. I've been told he's a pretty bad-tempered dog, actually.
No.
But he had a lot of bad experiences in his life, so we should probably give him a little room.
Yeah, we'll give him a little room. He has earned a very comfortable retirement wherever he chooses it to be. So one thing that I want to point out, going back to the question of the Russians, there was this moment where you say, at 3:30, we received some concerning news. The Russians told us that any U.S. military movement into... This was worrisome. It's an understatement. This was worrisome. But I think your decision to go anyway is both the right decision and also somewhat of a brave one. And today, what we see with the U.S. is a lot of self-deterrence. We kind of talk ourselves out of an activity we want to do because we're worried about escalation, we're worried about the consequences. Talk a little bit about that calculation and what advice you would give to today's policymakers so that we are not self-deterring.
So if the goal of our policy is to prevent escalation, then we need to leave, because that's the only way you're going to prevent escalation.
Very simply put.
So that's sort of my approach to it. That's the advice I would give. Preventing escalation, certainly we need to consider it, but you need to think about you need to think about it, because the other guy, whoever you're talking about, be it the Syrians, the Iranians, or whomever, they will respond to rational measures that we have found. So there are things you can do to control that escalation. At the same time, certainly you need to recognize that escalation could occur. But generally in the region, while the Syrians, the Russians in the region, and the Iranians might own the lower steps on the escalation ladder, we own the higher steps on the escalation ladder. Doesn't mean you want to go up the escalation ladder, but we just need to have a clear-eyed view of the relative capabilities, because I can assure you the other guys have a clear-eyed view of the relative capabilities.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. A big part of the book, and I mean a big part of the book, you spend talking about this escalation question and some very nuanced points that go back and forth between the US government and the Iranian government. And there's always this dance with the Iranians where it's we want to send a very clear message that we will not accept what you have just done. On the other hand, here's a message that we are not looking for a full-scale war.
Right.
So I want to talk about Soleimani in particular, but then also just sort of Iran more broadly,
Sure.
and how the
Sure.
U.S. government should think about Iran. Set the stage for us on the Soleimani strike.
Sure. So the Soleimani strike occurred the first week of January.
First of all, who is Qassem Soleimani?
So Qassem Soleimani
Aside
is
from the most interesting terrorist in the world.
the IRGC, Ukrainian Republican Guard Corps, Quds Force, which is an elite within an elite, a commander. He was born 1956, 1957, very charismatic, a good leader who was very active across the region. He could go into Iraq and knock Shia militant heads together, get them all to align on a certain thing. He had significant combat experience. He was held in high regard by everyone. Moreover, he had a direct familial relationship with the supreme leader, which allowed him to go outside and around routinely the Iranian chain of command, which induced a lot of friction with the Artesh, the Iranian Joint Chiefs, and their own typical military chain of command, which a little different, but not completely unlike our own. But Soleimani was able to do this because he typically produced successful results. And as long as he's riding a stream of success, his access is unimpeded to the supreme leader. If he wants to do something and he doesn't like the answer he's getting at the ministerial level, he'll go straight to the supreme leader and get the answer that he needs to have. So over the course of many years, he killed a lot of Americans. Killed a lot of Americans late in the Iraq War when he brought explosively formed penetrators into Iraq. And at that point, we were not willing to set a red line that the Iranians could understand, so many Americans died as a result of that. And that responsibility and the blood lies directly with Qassem Soleimani and other activities across the region. So by the summer of 2019, the Iranians, feeling the effects of the maximum pressure campaign, are trying to find a way to reach out and cause a perturbation that may reset the terms of the dialogue. And they elect to do that by considering attacking the United States bases in the region in May of 2019 and actually attacking bases, not bases, but attacking ships off UAE and other places around the region with some degree of deniability, but not a lot of degree of deniability. So what happens is the Iranians have read our force posture in the theater. It's gone much lower over the past couple of years. Not a carrier in the region. Not fighter squadrons are down. Patriot batteries and battalions are down. So then they listen to our dialogue, which is explicit about pivoting to the Pacific. Mm-hmm. So the opportunity looks good for them. So they press this. And the Iranians, I've written about this, it's like Lenin's dictum, you stick a bayonet in. If you reach mush, you keep pushing the bayonet. If you reach steel, you pull it back out. So they're looking for how far they can go. We don't send them clear signals of how far they can go. So we reinforced the theater massively in May, June of 2019, which sends a signal to the Iranians. We do a lot more intelligence and overflights of them, particularly their shipping at sea, where they had missiles they were perhaps going to fire at our bases. They don't like to be seen preparing to do that, so that tends to deter them when you act like that. They continue, though. In July 2019, they shoot down a Navy RQ-4 drone flying at 40,000 feet on the southern side of the Strait of Hormuz. The decision was probably made by a low-level commander. I would argue, had we then acted strongly, we could have changed the course of future events, but we did not. Ultimately, we chose not to strike back. We did a low-level cyber attack. We had another package of attacks ready to go, but it's called off, not at the last minute, not that dramatic, but a couple hours out. And so why that decision was made is another story, but we didn't do it. So the Iranians draw a lesson from that. They draw a lesson that they can keep pushing. That leads you to the attack on Saudi Arabia in September 2019, the oil fields in northeast Saudi. Significant attack, very successful attack from the Iranian point of view. They've never claimed responsibility for it to this day. At the same time, other attacks across the region begin to pick up on our bases in Iraq and Syria and other places. We get to the fall of 2019, the attacks continue to pile up. Till in December, we finally respond. Tit for tat, back and forth, and pressure begins to build against our embassy. At this point in time, Qassem Soleimani is going to fly into Iraq around the first of the new year, and have very good reason to believe that he's going to coordinate attacks on our embassy and on other U.S. bases in the region. Mm-hmm. And so at that point, it becomes a tactical decision. We're thinking about the long-term effects of him going off the battlefield. But it's a tactical decision, and it has to do with protecting American lives and the lives of our friends and allies in the region. If you don't take him off now, then the risk of inaction is greater than the risk of action. There's risk associated with action, and I actually thought about that pretty long and hard, and my views were heard. But I ultimately was in favor of preventing him from being the coordinator of further attacks in Iraq. Mm-hmm. So he arrived in Baghdad, late night Baghdad time, late afternoon CENTCOM time here in Tampa, and we struck him in his vehicle en route Irish, which I thought was a sort of macabre. I drew a little sense of karma from that because he had killed a lot of Americans on route Irish, and so we got him on route Irish, and so what happened then was the guy that spoke last in all the Iranian meetings wasn't there to speak last. Mm-hmm. You saw a little policy discontinuity there. In fact, Foreign Minister Zarif, some months later, made the mistake of recording an oral history inside Iran that, of course, was leaked by an Iranian who didn't like him. The New York Times published it. It's worth reading because he says in the New York Times text of it that the death of Soleimani was a blow to us like losing a major city in Iran.
Oh, wow.
So it set them back because, as you know, when you calculate deterrence, the cognitive space of the opponent makes a decision based on his assessment of your capability, which they've never doubted, and our will, which they have always doubted. So the strike on Soleimani, I would argue, went a long way to reset that. Mm-hmm. So we knew the Iranians would respond. I did not think they would respond massively, but I thought they would.
So before we get to the response, let's pause for a second and talk about Soleimani and the strike itself. So I do think there is always that debate. If you take somebody off the battlefield, there's somebody just as capable going to come up behind them and fill the spot. And in this case, truly no. He was on the extreme end of capable. Right. He was always one of the examples I pointed to is when you have an opponent that you should not underestimate, and you can hate them and also respect them at the same time, because he was so good at his job. Right. You talk about this risk-benefit calculation, and there was a moment where he was supposed to be flying to Baghdad, but instead he flew to Damascus. Right. And he was airborne, and we were actually considering taking out the flight that he was on. Right. But as you say, there were probably at least 50 innocent people on board. Upon learning this, I told the chairman I recommended we not consider shooting it down. Remember the Vincennes? I told him the U.S. record of shooting down Iranian airliners is not that good, and not even Soleimani was worth that loss of life. And so you agreed not to engage. And I think that really speaks to who we are as Americans, in addition to who they are as Iranians, like as well as the Iranian IRGC, I should say specifically. That idea about respecting life, respecting innocent life, and not being willing to take that shot because we didn't know who was on board.
Right, and also, candidly, we felt we'd have further opportunities to take the shot.
And we did, yeah. We thought there'd be a better opportunity.
I need to be clear about that. It wasn't a one-time thing. He was going to Damascus. We felt we had reason to believe he would come back from Damascus to Baghdad. Of course, that's what he did in a couple of days.
Right. So he comes back. We get him on route Irish, which, for those who haven't seen the map, it's a road that goes directly from the Baghdad airport towards Baghdad proper, and it is where a lot of U.S. servicemen died at the hands of the IRGC. So I interrupted your story. You were talking about retaliation. No,
so we felt they would retaliate. We didn't know the scope and scale of it. I thought it would be measured. Took them a little while to get to that decision, again, because the person that used to bang the table and say, here's what we're going to do, was not in a position to bang the table anymore. So it took them a while to make the decision. They attacked us at al-Asad, ballistic missile attack. And I think, first of all, we were able to move our forces so the attack did not kill anybody. That's great work by the men and women on the ground. We had a way to know that, and so we applied that. Now, we had cases of mild traumatic brain injury, and mild is just the diagnosis. I wouldn't characterize it necessarily as mild, but that's just the phrase we use.
Right.
But that was the first time U.S. forces had been struck by ballistic missiles with large warheads. So it was new terrain for us as well. So it took us a couple of days to work out those injuries, but eventually we did. But clear in the immediate hours afterward was nobody died.
Yeah.
At the same time, the Iranians transmitted a message through the Swiss that they were ready for this episode to be over if we were. And at that point, President Trump, I think, very wisely allowed it to be over.
But all right,
now, had they killed Americans, we might have been in a very different place. But we saved the Iranians from themselves, perhaps, in the way that we postured the force.
This is indeed a continuing theme with the Iranians. they do something against us. We save them from themselves by protecting our forces capably, and then every once in a while something goes wrong.
That's right.
And we can't actually protect ourselves the way that we intended to. So is it a taunt for the 20 came in and actually hit someone?
That's correct.
Because there was,
the problem is that even with the best of systems and the best of people, the law of the battlefield is reversion to the mean.
Right.
Eventually something bad will happen. It's inevitable, no matter how good your systems are, no matter how good your people are.
Right. And we did, I think, save them from themselves in the particular attack, the retaliation for Soleimani.
Yes.
There was a big debate at the time about, well, were the Iranians specifically targeting certain parts of the airfield to ensure that they didn't kill anyone? You take the opposite position in the book.
Okay.
You say it became clear to me the Iranians were not trying to avoid casualties with their attack. Instead, their missiles were targeted at locations where we had aircraft positions and where maintenance and living areas were. We escaped serious casualties because commanders repositioned aircraft, personnel, and some equipment after the Iranians took their last pre-strike look.
That's correct.
Yeah, so we did. We saved them from themselves. Yeah, but also amazing advanced planning by our folks to try to
good, wonderful people on the
had.
ground. Great leadership on the ground.
Right. So when you think, looking out into the future, as we're coming to our last 15 or so minutes here, think about what should we be messaging to the Iranians now? You have a great set of lines in the book about how to think about the CENTCOM theater in general. You talk about it as the least loved area. You talk about it as the Brits did with the intersection of 4 maps. We've heard about the pivot to Asia so many times, and then we keep getting dragged back into the Middle East. As you look at the CENTCOM AOR today, what advice do you have from your long, hard-won experience?
Sure. So when you think about Iran is motivated principally in their actions by 3 considerations. The first consideration is regime preservation. They view themselves as having a revolutionary regime. They know that the revolutionary generation is passing from the stage, and the challenge all entities that have that kind of revolution have is how do you preserve the revolution to successive generations. They're very concerned about that. So regime preservation is beginning and the end of Iranian foreign policy, their number 1 priority. Priority number 2, I would argue, is the destruction of the state of Israel, very important to them. Number 3 is ejection of the United States from the region. Now, 2 and 3 may change order. Sometimes 3 becomes 2, 2 becomes 3, but neither 2 or 3 ever challenge 1. So if you know and understand that, then you can see how the Iranians will behave rationally and may first appear irrationally, but you know and understand how you can apply pressure to them. So we should remember that. For example, I would never take, if we're striking, if we say we're going to potentially strike Iran, I would never take metropolitan Iran off the table. Let them worry we're going to strike there.
Sure.
Do or don't strike there as you wish, and we have not struck there yet. But the willingness to do that sends a message. So I'll give you just an excellent example of what happened in April. So the Iranians struck at Israel. We know the attack on, I think, 13 April was designed to take out Nevatim airfield. And that was the result of Iran being outfought for the last couple of years around the theater in the shadow war they fight with the Israelis, with Israeli intelligence, with Israeli proxy forces, and the same with the Iranians, culminating in the 1 April strike on IRGC planners in Damascus. So Iran felt they had to reset the table. And so to reset the table, they took a play from the Russian playbook, which is you escalate to de-escalate. You don't like the terms of the engagement, you do something dramatic to convince your opponent that, whoa, we need to sit back and rethink. And they chose to do it with what I think are the crown jewels of Iran, their ballistic missiles, their drones, and their land attack cruise missiles. And they chose Nevatim airfield because it was where they think the Israelis launched the attack on Damascus. Don't know if it was or wasn't, but there you go. So they launched the attack, and it failed. And it failed, and it was not a signal any more than the attack on al-Asad was that we're messaging, they were trying to hurt Israel. Mm-hmm. The fact that they were unable to do so, first of all, Israeli good performance. Second, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and other Arab nations in the region were supportive of Israel and allowed certain things to happen that made it possible for Israel to better defend itself and for them to assist in the defense of Israel. And so a lot of lessons to be learned from that attack. But what happened on the back end of the attack, so it's happened. The Israelis are certainly going to launch a counterattack. My concern was when you launch this, it needs to be one that's not overwhelming. You want to do one that still demonstrates your technological superiority. And so the Israelis did launch what I thought was a very smart response. They struck in and around Iranian nuclear facilities in a way that the Iranians are still puzzled about exactly what happened. But they didn't kill a bunch of people in downtown Tehran, which would have generated pressure on the Arab neighbors of Israel as well as the United States. So that was a real smart, now that's signaling, that's brilliant signaling there, and knowing the possibility of escalation. So what's happening now? Israel's stronger, Iran's weaker. Iran will learn from this. They will continue to produce missiles. Their missiles will get better. We're certainly not at the end of this, but but the regime is a little less steady now than perhaps it was before this happened.
Yeah, I remember right before the Israeli retaliation for the attack, having a conversation with somebody about this and saying, to respond appropriately, the Israelis are going to have to send this very carefully tailored signal that hits right between this post, and that is almost impossible to do. And then the next day they did it. And it was astonishing they managed to hit that exact right tone. And I think that's an interesting example of the Israelis understanding the Iranian calculus far better than the Iranians understand the Israeli calculus. Because escalate to de-escalate is not something the Israelis are going to respond to well.
No, because again, the Israelis own the higher steps on the escalation ladder.
Right. And as they see it as an existential threat, that is something they are going to respond to. So let's continue to look ahead. In the last chapter of the book, you do kind of a rapid fire round of your thoughts on a bunch of really difficult issues. You talk about the next war being driven by information. Collecting it, using it efficiently, denying an adversary's ability to do the same will be the central calculus. One of the things that I study in my research is the speed of decision-making and how technology is going to affect the speed of decision-making. And as we look at things like AI being used on the battlefield, what do you think that does to the person who's leading the Marines on the ground? What do you think that does for the person who's sitting in the CENTCOM commander's chair? What do you think that does for the person sitting in the Situation Room? So
I think first of all, our ability to pass information is going to be challenged to a degree that we haven't seen before. Because I think the next battlefield, you're going to see electromagnetic pulse. It's going to either be from nuclear weapons that are deployed directly to the battlefield or in low Earth orbit, or directed energy weapons that are going to have the effect of scrambling your ability to pass information. We are addicted to information. We're addicted to the satellite constellation, and we're going to lose some of those pathways. So I think
Say what an electromagnetic pulse is, just for
So
those
an electromagnetic
along.
pulse is the energy that typically is generated from a nuclear explosion. Mm-hmm. There are ways to manufacture it that don't involve nuclear fission. They're complex. There are ways to do it. But typically, it's a nuclear weapon. And you can optimize a nuclear weapon to produce these effects and lower your blast and radiation effects. Although it is a radiation effect that we're talking about.
Sure.
And it has the
kills
ability,
electronics for
kills electronics. Let me give you an example.
radius.
If you set one off 100 miles over Washington right now, nobody's phone's ever going to work again. No car in the city is ever going to drive again. No computer's ever going to work again. Airplanes are going to fall out of the sky. But no one's going to die from blast. No one's going to die from radiation. No one's going to die from radiation burns. But a lot of people are going to die. So that now you get into non-kinetic effects achieved in a complex way. I think these effects are inevitable on the next battlefield. Mm-hmm. Here's the interesting thing. In the 1980s, we understood this far more clearly than we do now. Mm-hmm. When I was a captain trained by the Army at the Armor Officer Advanced Course at Fort Knox, Kentucky, we knew we were going to operate in a nuclear battlefield in Europe. And so you assumed you would not be able to communicate. And so you always planned for what do you do if you can't communicate with higher? And so we have lost that. We have become addicted to the satellites and the teraflops of information that we can pass back and forth because it allows you to make good decisions. It's the sense of perfect knowledge. Well, the fact of the matter is you're not going to have perfect knowledge. It's going to be challenged. And that's where AI can be helpful if you're able to devolve it to a low enough level. For example, I think the future of some forms of AI is going to be coupling unmanned assets with manned assets. The Air Force is already doing that right now. You could do it with tanks. You can do it with infantry formations. And what the beauty of that then is, if you lose the ability to talk to higher, you still might be able to talk at a lower level. Although I think that's going to be challenged too. I think we are far too optimistic about the future in terms of the sanctity of information. And information and the ability to pass it is actually going to be gravely challenged in any future conflict.
All right, I was talking to Sue Gordon earlier, the former Deputy Director of National Intelligence. She was saying this exact same point, that trying to preserve the integrity of information is going to be the next battlefield of the future, and I completely agree with her.
She's right. She's absolutely right.
Just knowing what you can trust coming out of the field as opposed to what you can't, and what you can act on and what you can't.
That's right.
One thing that I'm really curious about is that as over the last 20 years, even I, in my somewhat still nascent career, have seen the amount of information that comes out of the field and lands on the policymaker's desk just explode. And then on top of that, the speed of that information is so fast that you do really have the proverbial 1,000-mile screwdriver, 8,000-mile screwdriver. And in some ways, that has the effect of slowing the decision-making process, because the policymaker always wants more information. Give me more. The next piece of information is going to make this decision easy, so give me that extra piece of information. But on the other hand, you're in a role where you have to make very fast decisions, and you have to do it knowing that you're never going to have complete information. You're never going to have that perfect picture. As you think about leadership in our last 5 minutes or so, as you think about leadership in the next generation coming up behind you, you start off the book actually with talking about going back to your alma mater and seeing the next generation coming up, thinking about what your role means for them. How would you give them advice about being that brave leader in a time of crisis?
So, sort of two principles that really that I adhere to. The first is, for any leader, the task is, how do you communicate energy with affection? It's hard to do, because you are in charge. You got to give orders. People have got to follow those orders. In a perfect world, you want to be able to explain those orders. And I have found that if I have the opportunity to explain why we're doing this, for American men and women in uniform, it always works better. And so whether you're explaining things to an infantry battalion of 1,000 people, it's actually easier to explain it to an infantry battalion of 1,000 people standing on a platform than it is to sit down as a CENTCOM commander and talk to 9 3-star generals that you got to bring on board. This is my plan. Here's what we're going to do. Because they've all got 30 years or more service. They bring cultural, strategic, conceptual bias, just as I have mine. So we've got to find a middle ground there. So it's always better to do it in a way that allows you to have the conversation the next day if you can. Sometimes you have to be very direct. I got to have you do this right now, and I don't have time to talk about why. You want to minimize those encounters, and sometimes you got to have them, but you're always better if you invest to talk about why we're doing this. What's the larger purpose behind it? The other thing that I found very helpful when I have to make hard decisions is, we always think of the military as a triangle. Leader on top, alone. Next level, few people, down, down, down. Finally, you get down to the people on the ground, huge base of the triangle. And that's true legally, but when you've got to make a decision, it helps to flip it. Because at Central Command, there was no shortage of people waiting to help me. My squad of lawyers, I had some of the brightest operations, intelligence, logistics officers in the armed forces of the United States. So there's no loneliness at the top, particularly when it comes to getting advice. The further you go towards the enemy, though, it gets lonely. Till finally you get down to the man or woman who's actually in contact with the enemy, where they're flying a single-seat fighter, or they're in a multi-crewed aircraft, they're in a fighting position, they're in a submarine. It's a single person. And so when I made hard decisions, and I made some, you want to think about that person. And you want to make sure, have I done everything I can to, first, we're here to do the mission. That's why we're here. If we weren't here to do the mission, de-escalation would be our primary goal, and we'd go home. But we're here to do the mission, but we want to bring our people back. And you want to think about that, and that's got to be part of every decision that you make. And I try to do that, sometimes with success, sometimes without success.
Yeah, I think that's great words to live by for any leader, thinking about the coalition of people you need at the top, but also thinking about the person who is at the point of the spear and how they're going to experience this order, and understanding the why.
There's nothing between them and the enemy but their shirt.
Right.
So you just need to think about that.
And this is one thing that is a true strength, I think, of our system, our military, is that people on the ground can think for themselves and they can make decisions. They're going to follow orders, but they can also improvise and they can decide and they can, know where their sphere is, where they can make decisions on their own without having to go up. And that kind of agility is something that's going to really benefit us in the wars of the future.
The secret sauce of the Joint Force are the young enlisted leaders. The corporals, the sergeants, the staff sergeants, the sergeants first class, the gunnies, the chiefs. They're the people that actually, it's unique in the U.S. Some of our allies have similar things, but the Russians don't have that, which is why they're struggling in Ukraine. It's why generals are going forward to battalion command posts and being killed, because they don't have that middle management level. And that's the important thing. It's the envy of the world. And so the young officers and the young enlisted people, you're right, actually can think for themselves. But since they can think for themselves, you owe them that they know why you're requiring them to do this. And when you have the opportunity to explain it, the force will always perform better.
And on that note, we will end this as an homage to the folks who are coming up in the ranks, to those junior enlisted, to those junior officers who are going to follow in your footsteps and also go on to do great things. And I look forward to talking to them about their books in the future. Thank you so much for being here, General McKenzie. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Emily. I enjoyed it.